you. Thank you. Thanks so much, Rob. Can everyone hear us? Can everyone hear me? Yes, good. Okay, great. Well, I don't need to do introductions, so that's brilliant. So we can just start talking. I was going to start actually because I had written, the problem actually with your introduction there, Robert, is that now you having done that, I had written this very kind of clever introduction which said at the end of it that Mohamed was also, on top of all the other millions of things that he does and the millions of amazing things that he's done, that he's also a columnist occasionally for Bloomberg and for the FT, and you might have read his column this morning. Whereupon I then would have said, shall we talk about what you were talking about this morning? So I'm going to do that. I'm going to start with that. And this kind of gets us to talking about the state of the global economy right now, and indeed the UK economy, which is quite a good place to start. You were writing about the Fed, about the decisions that they now have to make, so whether they're going to skip this week. What's your take on that? And can you say a bit about kind of the issues they're confronted with in the state of the US and global economy?
Sure. First, let me say what a great pleasure and honor it is to be here. And thank you very much for inviting me. So the Fed has three options on Wednesday. And I'm going to use the words that are used: skip, pause, or hike. Hike is simple. They've increased interest rates 10 times in a row for a total of 5 percentage points, and hike would be another 0.25 percentage point increase. Pause would mean they would stop, and the market would interpret that as the next move being a cut in interest rates. So they had to introduce a third concept called skip. And the idea of skip is you pause for this meeting in order to get some more information with the inclination to resume hiking at the next meeting. So three different policy options, and the whole framing of the debate has been which of these three they should do. And Fed officials are all over the place. So the people who actually make the decisions have come out. Some favor a hike because inflation is still too high. Some favor a pause because the economy is already slowing and they're worried about a recession. And some favor a skip because they think they need more information, more data to decide what's the right course of action. Because it's been framed in this way, it misses the big elephant in the room, and it focuses everybody on three imperfect choices. Tomorrow we get the inflation numbers, so that's going to have a huge influence on what they decide on Wednesday. But they have guided the markets, and the markets believe that they're going to skip. So the market is only pricing a 20% probability that they increase rates next time, very different from the Bank of England, very different from the European Central Bank, and a 65% probability that they're going to raise in July. So that is what they have guided the market to do. If they don't do that, then the market will have a bit of a turmoil. Among the three choices, that's probably the worst choice. But it is the one that looks like a compromise, but in my view, it's a muddled middle. You won't gain much in a month, and you're not looking at the real issue, which is that we have sticky inflation, and we have to make a decision as to whether we're operating with the right model of the economy. Much bigger issue, but that's not where the debate is right now.
But okay, so on that, when you're talking about sticky inflation, model of the economy, what is that? There's a big picture story there about where we are right now.
So we are now operating in an economy that has changed shape completely. Up to the pandemic, the problem was not enough demand. There wasn't enough demand in the system. And when there isn't enough demand on the system, governments, central banks are tempted to throw money at the problem. And if you don't have inflation, you just throw more and more money. And we have thrown an enormous amount of money at the economy. It didn't work very well, but that was the analysis. Now, our problem is not demand. If anything, there's too much demand in the system because of the amount of money that's been thrown in. The problem is supply. And there are 4 factors that are hindering supply that go beyond the pandemic. This is not a pandemic issue. The pandemic was a catalyst, but what we're seeing goes well beyond. This is a multi-year phenomenon. And you've heard about it, changing globalization. US-China tensions are changing the way the global economy is wired. That's inflationary. Companies themselves are worried about resilience. They realized at the pandemic that they had taken efficiency too far. The just-in-time now comes with just-in-case. So you start building redundancy in your supply chains. That's inflationary. The energy transition, that's inflationary. And of course, the way the labor market functions and the unfilled vacancies, that's inflationary. So we're living in a world of deficient supply. In this world, and this is where it gets controversial, you wouldn't choose a 2% inflation for everyone. It's as if I come to you and say, all of us should have the same weight target. Some of us are tall, some of us are short. There's no way we should have the same weight target. And yet the US, the UK, Europe, New Zealand, Australia, and others all have the same inflation target, 2%. And we've never had to question it because inflation has been too low. But this is the time where we should be questioning what's the right inflation target.
So that's a lot of what you said is pretty seismic stuff there. A change in kind of the nature of globalization, change in the nature of the economy that we've become pretty used to since kind of 1990s, 2000s. So if that is indeed changing, what is the kind of inflation target? Is there just a new normal we need to get used to?
So I suspect if you were to bring a group of experts in a room and say, come up with the right inflation target, it is more likely to be 3 than 2. And I know it doesn't sound like a big difference, but it's a huge difference. The problem...
And that's 3 in the US, 3 in the UK, 3 pretty much everywhere.
3 in the US, probably slightly higher in the UK. And we
in the UK, okay.
And we can come back to why it is UK inflation is the highest among the 3 major areas. Why is it that UK core inflation is going up, not down?
We've noticed this.
Right. But the problem is that when you have missed your target and you've lost credibility, which is the case of the major central banks, it is very difficult for you to embrace another target. So no central bank wants to talk about this in public. But I suspect in private, they know that one of the issues they have is the wrong inflation target.
Can I just pick you up there? You said when you've lost credibility. So, all of the central banks have lost credibility?
Yes, I mean, that's what the surveys show. The first loss of credibility happened in 2021 when inflation was called transitory. Transitory is a really dangerous word because when I tell you something is transitory, I'm telling you it is temporary, it is reversible, don't worry about it. Don't change your behavior. The official term, as you know, Ed, is you look through it. It's unpleasant, but you just look through it. And most central banks, all central banks, the major ones, fell into the trap of calling it transitory. The Bank of England was the first one to get out of that trap. It was the first central bank to acknowledge it had made a mistake. Until today, the Fed has not done that. But the ECB and the Bank of England had explained why they've made that mistake. So once you fall behind inflation, this is the dynamic. It goes from being a few items, food and energy. Then it gets embedded in the goods sector because food and energy are inputs into all sorts of things. And if demand is strong, companies are able to increase prices. So it becomes in the goods sector. And then next thing you know, it jumps to the service sector. It jumps to wages. And that jump is really problematic because interest rate policy can't get to that easily. That sector is less sensitive. So you end up with what used to be a dilemma, but is today a trilemma. The dilemma in the old days, as all of you know, is can you reduce inflation without pushing the economy into recession? The trilemma of today is can you reduce inflation without pushing the economy into recession and without causing financial instability?
Right.
We've seen what high interest rates did suddenly to the pension system. We see what they did to the mortgage system. In the US, you've had the 2 largest bank failures in history. So once you fall behind, you are so deep in the world of second best that everything you do has collateral damage and unintended consequences. And the discussion you end up having is, if we make a mistake, what's the least bad mistake? And you never want to be in that situation. That's why it's really bad when you fall behind on the inflation front.
I'm trying to kind of to dig out some positive interpretations to what you said, and it seems like maybe one semi-positive thing is it sounds like the Bank of England, because I mean, you know, here domestically, a lot of the coverage, you know, that we've read about the Bank of England, a lot of the commentary has been pretty negative. But actually, you're saying that compared with what the Fed are doing, compared with what the ECB are doing, actually they're not doing that badly.
Okay, so let me just start by an acknowledgement. The governor of the Bank of England went to my college, but nothing that I'm about to say is influenced by that statement. Look, it's easy to bash the Bank of England. UK inflation is higher than US and European inflation. They have this inflation, same inflation target, UK inflation, so they've messed up more. 2, core inflation is going up. But if you were to do what you do at the Olympics, which is you adjust for the degree of difficulty, how actually difficult the situation was and is, then the Bank of England looks the best among the 3 central banks. It acknowledged first that it had made a mistake. It hiked interest rate first, way before the Fed, 4 months before the Fed, and even more before the ECB. It had the most honest communication. There could have been better ways to do it, but it is the central bank that came out and warned that inflation would go up to 13% if the government didn't do something on energy. It is a central bank that warned about wage price hikes. Other central banks have been very political. This central bank has been very technocratic. So it's easy, I understand why people bash it, but for those who actually look at the functioning of central banks and adjust for degrees of difficulty, it has actually been the better in that group.
And the handicap score has been
correct,
slightly better than the others. But specifically, so why is inflation so high in the UK? Is that is there a Brexit thing? Is it an import dependence thing?
So 3 things. One is we've had lagging productivity for a very long time. The economy is less elastic, doesn't adjust as quickly. 2 is we decided to redefine our trading relationships with the rest of the world. And we dismantled something without a clear idea of what would replace it. And therefore, our supply chains became more problematic. And 3, we have something, and I went to boarding school here. I remember the 70s. We have what's called real wage resistance. People go on strike here much more easily than elsewhere when they feel that their standard of living is being eroded. So you have another element that comes in, which is inflationary, which is what's happening on the labor side, the industrial action. So you put these 3 things together, you will end up with a higher inflation rate.
By the way, sorry, that last thing, the industrial kind of propensity to strike, that's still the case now, is it?
Absolutely.
Even despite all of the kind of, Thatcherite reforms, despite all of the changes in the labour market? But it's not as bad as in France, right?
So even France, I mean, who else has had doctors, ambulance, trains, airports? I mean, just look at the range that we've had. I can't think of another G7 country that has come close to that.
That's really
France, maybe, certainly not the US, certainly not Germany. Certainly not Canada.
That is really interesting, because I mean, one of the striking things, in the 70s was that we were the highest for inflation then. So it's just history repeating itself to some extent with a slightly different flavor?
Yes, and I hope history will repeat itself in getting people to focus. I mean, there is good news. I don't want people to think it's bad news. I mean, there's recognition that our fundamental issues, we don't know how to grow anymore. We do not know how to grow in a high, inclusive, and sustainable fashion. This is true for most of the Western economies. We've lost our ability to have a potent growth model, and that's really problematic. The second issue, and it's great that it's this conference, is that not only is there an issue of inequality of income and wealth, there's an inequality of opportunity. And that inequality of opportunity has been getting worse, which means that you have talent, but that talent cannot be unleashed. There's discussions going about that. And then third, we've understood much better what's wrong with domestic economic policy making and the lack of coordination that goes on. So, my hope is that what you'll get we'll come out stronger, because we recognize that we have these fundamental problems that we have denied for a very long time.
So, okay, having started with your comfort zone, the macro, I was thinking, given this is a build as a fireside chat, we could talk a little bit more about what matters to you, because you mentioned opportunity. You were at PIMCO Allianz now. You've had a long career in economics, I think the International Monetary Fund, in various different institutions, but now you're at Cambridge. Opportunity presumably matters to you, and you're seeing firsthand, what's happening with educational outcomes. Just tell us a bit about that and your perspective on it.
So I've been extremely lucky in my life because I went to where I am now. And I remember what I was like as an 18-year-old kid going in, and I remember what I was like coming out. And the experience completely transformed me. And the tools that I gained are tools that I still use today. So fast forward my career, I got to a stage where I decided that I would no longer have a full-time job. I wanted to spend more time with my 11-year-old daughter at the time. And I took what's called as the portfolio approach, which is lots of things, but you control your time. And I thought I would never have a full-time job again. And then this opportunity came up. And because I had experienced the transformational power of education, I wanted to go back to a place that takes access and participation extremely seriously and be part of it. So going back was about providing more opportunities to really bright kids, especially those who come from underprivileged backgrounds. And what I see every single day tells you that that's a really important bet for society. There are silly things that get in the way of talent. And that talent is unexploited, and everybody is worse off. And if you can lift these obstacles, and they're not very exciting, but it's a job you've got to understand what the issue is. I'll give you an example. When I was at PIMCO, which is an investment management firm, we hired people with advanced degrees. And we were very keen to have cognitive diversity. We wanted to have different people in the room because we believed that was better. And of course, it's merit-based. There's no compromises on merit. But to the extent that we could have cognitive diversity, that would be much better. And yet, the people we saw were not diverse at all. When I got to Cambridge, there was one person who had come top of her year, first generation university. No one in her year had gone to university. And we were absolutely convinced she was going to go on and do a second degree. And she decided to join the labor force. So we asked her why. And she said something really interesting. It's not just that I'm not sure whether I can afford another few years at university. There's enormous pressure on me to monetize my first degree. My family is putting enormous pressure on me. I'm the first one to go to university. They want me to go get a semi-skilled, skilled job. That person's father had very unskilled job, never went to university, lived in a caravan, and enormous pressure. So we came up with a very simple idea, and donors supported us, is to have a scholarship that in addition to paying for fees, maintenance, everything else, explicitly has an extra amount of money that people can do whatever they want with, as a supplement to what they need. That scholarship, 2/3 of the people who get that money send that amount home.
But that's unusual, is it? The structure, that particular
That's
structure.
completely unusual. But it came from talking to people and saying, what is it? The other thing we've learned is opening up access to education is a necessary but not sufficient condition. Many of the people who come from underprivileged background lack life skills. They don't have the environment I had where my parents told me what to wear to an interview. Okay, what's an interview like? So what you realize is there's all these institutional failures that get in the way of opportunity. And if you can relax them one by one, there is no one size fits all. You can provide much broader opportunities, and society is much better off as a result.
But do you find yourself feeling kind of, more anxious or more excited when thinking about the futures of some of the young people who are at college? Because I think, for a lot of us who look at the lot of younger people taking on greater student debt than ever before, facing potentially greater challenges than ever before in the workplace, how much of that do you just think, well, they've got it tougher than any previous generation?
So I think they've got it tougher for many other reasons. I have 2 daughters, and I constantly apologize to them because my generation is leaving them with a debt problem, a growth problem, an inequality problem, and a climate problem. And I'm saying, I'm sorry, we messed up. We thought we could increase debt forever. We thought it didn't matter that we didn't take growth seriously enough, and we didn't respect our planet. And as a result, you have all that. But the good news is there are also many more tools than my generation had to make things better. So yes, undoubtedly, I'm anxious about the burdens that the younger generation have, undoubtedly, but I'm also incredibly excited about the tools they have to try and address these challenges.
Talking about tools, actually, one thing that I know has come up, and it is one of the big topics of the day, is AI, artificial intelligence. Which camp do you find yourself drawn towards? Because as we all know, there are some people who are kind of AI doomsters, and other people who think that AI is going to completely save the world and solve all of our problems. Is it going to put us all out of work? Is it going to be kind of an enormous challenge? Where do you when you read all this coverage or use ChatGPT, do you find yourself kind of, feeling terrified or feeling excited?
Both. A disruptive innovation is called disruptive for a reason. It can make good things happen, it can make bad things happen. Every single innovation that has come has had those 2 elements to it. And there's a second aspect, which is the first round of an innovation tends to end up in tears. Happened with the steam engine, happened with fiber optics. And there's a reason with that, is, we as humans, the minute you reduce the barrier of entry to an activity we want, we will overproduce it and we'll overconsume it. Okay, I can take you innovation after innovation where we all rush in to produce it and consume it, and next thing we know, we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the architecture, and then we start rebuilding it. So it doesn't surprise me that we're having this mix right now, because we realize that there's benefits and there's risks. But this is one of the most exciting innovations. It has enormous potential in terms of leveling the playing field. It has enormous potential in terms of improving productivity, but it also has enormous risk with it. And governments are not going to be able to regulate this well. There's going to have to be industry regulating as well.
But how about that stuff about wiping out humanity? Do you read that and think, oh, come on?
I do tend to say, oh, come on.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
I'm quite glad to hear that.
But look, I grew up, and I'm old, when the calculator came in. We weren't allowed to use a calculator in exams. We had to have a slide rule, because somehow the calculator would take away our ability to do arithmetic, which is true, by the way. But then when finally we were allowed to have a calculator, it was only a basic calculator. Today, we realize that these are tools, and what we need to do is create the right infrastructure, the right environment to use these tools, but we can't deny the tools. And, this notion that you can stop. So, for example, the best teachers are terrified of ChatGPT because it can produce an essay, and it's actually very hard. So, one of the professors that I respect the most, when they issue the paper, the question, they also send what ChatGPT responded as a way to tell the student, you know what, I'm on you, okay? This is what ChatGPT said, right? And think a little bit about that answer, because there's lots of mistakes in it as well when you write your essay. So he's not denying, this particular professor is not denying, he's saying just be careful how you use it.
One of the first things I did, obviously, as a journalist when ChatGPT became available was I went online and I asked it I commissioned a column on quantitative easing, I think, and whether it had been a total disaster or whether it had been great. And it came back with something that was, it was a bit bland and not especially original, but it was kind of close enough to make me quite nervous as a journalist. And then I said, okay, well, can you do the same thing in a Scottish accent? And it did.
Yeah.
So I don't know what that kind of implies.
And you can ask it, can you write it as a poem?
Right, exactly. And it can do it as a sonnet, not very good sonnets, but if it's a first iteration of this general purpose technology that will potentially change the world, it's already kind of more powerful than a lot of people had thought.
No, but you should be less worried. Your editor should be very worried.
Okay, that's good to know.
Okay, so when we write articles, we send it to an editor. I had a very simple experiment. I put it in ChatGPT and said, edit this draft for me. And it edited. So the content is all mine. It just moved sentences around. You
did this for one of your columns?
I did this for one of my columns, and I sent it to the editor. It's not for the FT, it's for another publication. And the editor hardly had any comments on the draft I sent. And then I told him, by the way, I ran that past ChatGPT. I'm worried about your job. But you should try it.
Yeah, no.
It's your content. It doesn't add anything.
I'm very assured by this, and I'm going to raise this with all of my bosses. So that's good news. Let's kind of go back to that thing that you talked about, because we've forgotten how to grow the economy. We've lost that habit of productivity. When you look at where we are right now, do you see kind of where are the areas where you think there are opportunities, where there's reason for hope? We were talking about this a little bit beforehand. Are we at the beginning of something exciting? Because some people say we are. Or are those enormous amounts of debt, amounts of inflation that you talked about earlier, just going to kind of completely overwhelm all of the good stuff?
Growth is the answer to lots and lots of problems. Sustainable growth is the answer to most problems.
Yeah.
Okay. We haven't lost the ability to grow. We've just looked for shortcuts. And it all started in the 2000s. In the 2000s, with the exception of Germany, the West stopped investing in human capital, stopped investing in infrastructure, stopped investing in enablers of productivity because we fell in love with finance. we somehow believed that finance was the next level of capitalism. So agriculture, industry, manufacturing, services, then you get to finance. Countries started to compete to be the financial center of the world. If you weren't big enough, if you were Iceland, if you were Switzerland, if you were Dubai, it didn't matter. You could grow finance to be a multiple of your economy because it's such a good thing. And we lost sight of the fact that it's not called finance, it's called financial services because it serves the real economy. So the private factories of leverage, of debt, of credit overdid it. We had the global financial crisis. At that point, we had a golden opportunity to reset. I'm talking about 2010. So 2008 is a global financial crisis. We're in emergency mode till March, April 2009. We come out of it. 2010, we have an ability to think about how to grow. And then central banks get into the act. And the central bank balance sheet replaced the private factories of credit. To give you the magnitude, the Fed's balance sheet went from below 2 billion to 9 billion. That's a whole lot of money. And the notion was just throw money at the problem, just throw money at the problem. And that's not the right answer. So yeah, we have a great ability, but it's hard. And it's not a really good political equation because it doesn't deliver immediately. You have to do hard stuff now for something that's 3 to 4 years in the future.
That's quite radical stuff, though, and also coming from a former financier as well. The problem was we became too obsessed with finance. We thought finance was a thing. We kind of forgot that it's financial intermediation. It is not, necessarily an enormous growth area in itself. But also critically that there was so much talk, wasn't there, in 2008, 2009, 2010 about the fact that it was the end of the road for finance, but we didn't follow through on it. Is that the point?
Correct.
We just put everything under the carpet and papered over the...
Correct. I mean, central banks came in. They wanted to be a bridge to a better world, and they became the only game in town. They basically became the only serious policymaker, and they got sucked in more and more, and they could never get out.
But specifically, what would that have involved if we had done it better? If we had had a genuine rethink about finance as opposed to everywhere else back in 2009, let's say, what would that have looked like?
We would have invested in infrastructure. We would have invested in people. We would have talked very seriously about about labor retooling. We would have gone back to the basics of growth, productivity. And it's human, it's labor, it's capital, and it's the way labor and capital interact. But we lost sight of this at all. Now, the good news I'm saying is we're going back there because we've run out of easy answers. Debt levels are too high. Central banks cannot flood us with money anymore. Inflation is too high. We have no choice but to go back to the basics. And if we try shortcuts, massive unfunded tax cuts, you end up with another problem. So this is really good. But I'm curious. I mean, you've written a book. You've written a book about basic elements that we need. Have we invested enough in this?
See, I can only ever ask questions, and now I feel very, ill at ease suddenly. I've written a book called Material World. It's coming out this week, but this is not, it's not what this is about, but it is available if you want to buy it. And the thing that I've found definitely from having looked, so the gist of the book is just trying to tell the story of the modern world through 6 materials without which we couldn't really kind of survive or thrive. So everything from sand, from which we get obviously silicon chips and also glass and also concrete. So we're talking about the infrastructure, we're talking about technology, all the way through to, via a few other materials, all the way through to lithium and lithium-ion batteries. And what's really striking, well, I suppose what's striking for me, that there's a few things. First of all, yeah, we particularly in the UK, deindustrialized so fast, and industry became, a bad word. And I think we did drink the Kool-Aid of the financialization, and we were very proud of the fact that we indeed are amazing at doing finance, but we kind of thought, well, that's enough to really put all our chips into that. And we allowed a lot of things that we were also very good at, making stuff, engineering, actually building things. We allowed that to kind of fall by the wayside, and we did so indirectly through, higher energy prices and various other regulations that made it difficult to get stuff done. And what's interesting about this moment that we're in right now is certainly in the US, it seems to me, Joe Biden has, and actually, hitherto, previous to him, to some extent, Donald Trump, have been trying to shift momentum. It's especially Joe Biden with the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act. And the emphasis now is on reindustrializing. And that's really interesting to me, both because it's an enormous policy in the US, but also because so far we don't really have that much of a policy here in the UK. And it feels like maybe because we became so enamored with the financial sector, with services, with intangibles, at which we are really good and which obviously matter, there's still a little bit of reluctance here in this country to try to kind of re-embrace reindustrialization, in all the ways that goes, bringing down energy prices, making it easier to build, making it easier to make stuff. But the other thing that strikes me, and I'm going to shut up because this really isn't about me and my book, which is available at all good bookstores. It's called Material World, by the way. It is that...
And it's out on Thursday.
And it's out Thursday, thanks, Mohamed. It is that while we were kind of stepping back and the US was stepping back on this, there was one country in particular that was going in the other direction and embracing all of this, and that was China. And the extent to which China dominates all of these industries which Joe Biden now wants to bring back into the US, apart from chips, which the US genuinely still has a lead in a lot of those different bits of it. The extent to which China dominates, the creation of polysilicon, which you need to make solar panels, you need to make into silicon wafers that you go into computers, the extent to which they dominate batteries, the extent to which they dominate, the manufacture of the steel that goes into wind turbines and the blades that go on wind turbines. Basically, anything to do with the green economy, China has this enormous foothold and lead and stranglehold over the global market, even as the noises towards China become more bellicose. And that, for me, is, I guess, the corollary to what you were talking about earlier, Mohamed, that the nervousness about the place that we're in at the moment, it's not just inflation, but of course this is very inflationary, talking about the supply side of the economy. But we are making some scary noises towards a country without which we can't actually make this stuff right now, and we need to learn pretty quickly how to make the stuff. And that's exciting, that's scary, but it's also exciting because these are skills that we know that we can do. These are things that we can potentially build. In the US, they're throwing a lot of money at people to actually make them. I think the question is, A, whether that's affordable, B, whether we end up doing something like that over here, or indeed whether there's a little bit of it that we can end up doing, and C, whether maybe I don't know, I'm just curious about where the UK sees its place in this, and I don't think we know that yet, and I don't think, frankly, the government knows that yet, and I don't know if the Labour Party quite know what our part is in all of this. But it's a moment, I think. And I think, I feel like we need, in order to do, okay, sorry, one more thing and I'll shut up. We need to do, the nature, the scale of what we need to do in order to get to net zero is utterly enormous, because we need to reimagine so many different parts of the industrial fabric. It's not just about wind turbines, it's not just about making hydrogen, it's not just about, carbon capture and all of those things. We need to think about how we refine metals better without emitting that much carbon. We need to think about how we're going to kind of make chemicals without doing it. There's so many different parts of the backbone of the world which we inhabit and which we touch on a daily basis that we need to think about doing again from scratch in the space of the next 30 years or even 25 years. That means basically doing another industrial revolution, because all the stuff we're touching right now came to us through the benefit of the many industrial revolutions we've had in the past. So trying to compress that into 25 years is one of the toughest tasks that we have ever had to do as a species. So that's going to be interesting. And it should be an enormous opportunity, but by the same token, boy, the challenge of trying to compress that all while also possibly alienating the country which is doing it best right now is pretty terrifying as well.
So clearly I should be asking the question and you should be answering them.
No, that's it.
So let me ask you, but related to that, Okay. The U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, which is a great name because
Because it's not anything like that.
yeah, it had nothing to do with inflation reduction, but people love the fact
It'll raise inflation.
it will, yes. As will nearshoring and friendshoring and everything else you hear. There's been two reactions to it. I'm going to ask you to pick a point in this range.
Yeah, but I'm going to ask you a question
Zero
back.
is protectionism, it's back to the past, it is industrial policy, it is about picking winners, it's going to fail. So that's 0 on your scale. 10, it is an incredible vision. It understands the failures that are going on, market, institutional, and the US has found something that not only makes economic sense, but makes national security sense vis-a-vis China. So if 0 is protectionism, industrial policy, failure, 10 is vision, economics, and national security. Where does Ed come into this?
I dispute the way you framed that question, Mohamed. I
Why?
think that's very, I don't know if it's
Why?
possible.
The Europeans have complained it's protectionism.
Yeah, no, well, it's true. It is undoubtedly parts of it are kind of very protectionist, explicitly protectionist, and undoubtedly parts of it are. Is it picking winners? It's picking sectors that might win. So it's not actually picking companies that are necessarily going to win.
Sectors.
But it's saying, okay, on hydrogen, here is the price we're going to pay you for X. For carbon capture, here's the price we're going to pay you. The scale of how expensive it is, and I'm going to kind of subtly turn this into a question, the scale of how expensive it is extraordinary. And I've been kind of screaming about how consequential and important the Inflation Reduction Act is for all of us for quite some time, and I don't know if it's kind of getting through. But this matters enormously, partly because companies in this country are leaving us right now to go and build factories in the US, partly because of those kind of geopolitical consequences, but partly because we just don't even know how big this is going to be. The CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, has put a vague estimate on how much of an impact this is going to be. Maybe they say it was at $350 billion. But it's entirely dependent on how much demand there is for all of these subsidies that the US is offering. And right now they're offering a lot, and people seem to be taking a lot. And the upshot of that is that it could be $1 trillion, it could be more than $1 trillion. And if that's the case, that's kind of like 4% of US GDP. It's a lot. Which raises this question, and I'd be curious for your take on this. Looking at some of the numbers on the US fiscal position. Okay, we had the debt ceiling crisis recently, and that it came and it went, and there was an accommodation, and Congress kind of sorted itself out to some extent. And it was portrayed, partly because this certainly is the case, in this country as being largely a sign of US political dysfunction. However, there's also something else going on there, which is when you look at those numbers, the trajectory of US deficit is getting bigger and bigger, and the trajectory of US debt is getting bigger and bigger as well, up to the highest levels it's been since the Second World War. And therefore, that's possibly an issue, isn't it? Does it look like the US has an unsustainable debt situation right now?
Okay, but you're really not going to give me a number between 0 and 10?
Oh, okay, all right. I mean, I just have to say 5, won't I? Because that's just the boring kind of,
Okay, I think it's 7.
Yeah, it might be 7.
Look, I think the worry about US debt is excessive right now for the simple fact that the US is a reserve currency. It's very different from the UK. Here, if we try to issue more and more debt, foreign investors will worry, they'll go elsewhere. The pound is not a reserve currency. It's not a natural home for so much of the world's capital. And then
as we learned quite recently.
As we learned, and we saw interest rates go up by 4 percentage points in a few days. The US is very different. People forget that the world often solves in relative terms, not in absolute terms. So when it comes to a currency, that's particularly true. It's a syndrome of the cleanest dirty shirt. So assume that you are on a business trip, that you've packed for the right amount of days, and suddenly your trip is extended and you can't get your shirt washed. You will have no choice but to go find your least dirty shirt and wear it. The shirt is not pristine by any means, but it's better than all the other alternatives. That's the case for the US dollar. The US dollar is not pristine. There's many things wrong with the US economy, including the debt. But it is better than any other shirt available. And that allows the US a much longer runway to get its act together. If you're a developing country, if you're Zimbabwe, then no one even thinks of your shirt as being anywhere clean. There's so many other shirts that can be worn before you that you immediately have a crisis. And then the UK is somewhere towards the US. So in the long term, do they have a problem? Yes. Will they feel it in the short term? No.
No. So they could borrow just more and more.
Correct.
And but the hope presumably is that there is enormous growth. And how, do you buy that? I mean, when you look at things like the Inflation Reduction Act, when you look at kind of US economic policy, do you see a lot of debt that's a lot of spending that's going to be wasted? Or do you see the beginnings of this new era of strong year-on-year growth?
So I see both, and that's what a political system will do. It will waste lots of money, but it will also enable things. If we can just go back to what we learned during the pandemic, we would be so much better off. During the pandemic, we learned how powerful private-public partnerships can be. The development of the vaccine was the most amazing public-private partnership. It delivered something that surprised people on the upside. It was delivered by commercial entities, but it also involved government support. So what was so special about that is that the government didn't come in and say, I'm going to set up a factory and I'm going to create the vaccine and produce it. It didn't come in and say, I'm going to give as much money as it needs. It came in and said, I'm going to take out catastrophic risk. I'm going to take the one risk that would paralyze a private company from pursuing a certain initiative. So it risk-tranched and didn't insure every level of risk. It insured the catastrophic risk. And once you take the catastrophic risk out of the equation for a company, it changes completely the equation. And what the Inflation Reduction Act is trying to do, but they've gone a little bit too far, is exactly the same thing, which is take out some of the catastrophic risk to allow all these new industries to take off.
Right, I see, okay. I should say, so we've got 5 minutes left. Let's just talk specifically about the UK. So we're in an interesting time right now. Well, actually, first of all, as someone who still has half a foot in the kind of international world of finance and economists, how would you say we're viewed right now?
I think we're viewed as people who shoot ourselves in the foot. That's how we're viewed. That not only are we in a difficult neighborhood, the global economy, but we tend to complicate life for ourselves. That's how we're viewed.
How long do those? And this is partly, obviously, presumably that's partly last year, but is it partly kind of the previous 4 years as well?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get into the Brexit debate, but I do know that in life, you do not dismantle something without knowing what you're going to put in place. Because when you dismantle things, there are massive transition costs. And the outside world says, well, the UK maybe had good reason to exit the EU, but what did it replace it with? I can't answer that question. The hope was a whole series of free trade agreements, but it's not happening with the US. It's not, Europe is still a bit of a mess.
We've got the Atlantic Partnership. Don't forget about the Atlantic Partnership.
Yes, well, maybe. So the outside world looks at the UK and say, okay, so you've decided you're a trading nation, you are a small open economy, that's how it's defined in economic terms, and yet I don't quite understand what your external relations are right now on the trade side, on the investment side. And then they look at us internally and they keep on seeing we sort of trip ourselves up. So I do think, there's a lot that has to be done to allow the UK an equal opportunity to grab these opportunities that are out there.
So what is your advice then to, whether it's the current government or indeed the government that might well be, how do they kind of push this country into the right direction?
Rethink your growth strategy. Have a growth model that works, that isn't reliant on throwing money at it and not investing in what enhances productivity. Appoint a growth czar, someone who is at the level of the Prime Minister's office. There's this notion in the US, the Council of the National Economic Council, which overlooks all the different entities to make sure that there's a common theme that goes across. Growth should be that common theme. Whenever there are policies designed, someone in the room should be asking, what does that imply for productivity? What does that imply for economic growth? So you try to hardwire it into the decision-making process and then accelerate the multilateral interaction. The UK has always punched above its weight on the global stage. And right now, it's punching below its weight on the global stage.
We did have a Prime Minister who was very obsessed with growth quite recently. So what are the lessons from that?
So 2/3 of what that Prime Minister proposed was correct. Had that Prime Minister done what Margaret Thatcher had done and waited on the unfunded tax cuts, we wouldn't have had the instability that we had. It was that third component. And it was interesting to me that when the market reacted, and the market reacted really quickly, the message wasn't heard. Because I remember the announcement, I remember what happened on the Thursday to Friday, that could have easily been recast during the weekend. We will have the tax cuts, but down the road. And we will do what happened under Margaret Thatcher. We will get the growth side correct first, and then we will do the tax cuts.
Yeah, that message was the one eventually, but not at that weekend.
Correct.
At that weekend, it was just more tax cuts. We've got more to come. Okay, so one final bit of advice. You said that we need to focus on, get a growth strategy. Is there one particular thing that we do in this country that you think is particularly, there's a great opportunity there? Education, maybe?
Education, we do great. We do lots of things well. We just somehow don't focus enough on this. If you ask me a different question, if I knew nothing about how the UK has been run, but I look at all that the UK has, the attributes, would I bet on the UK? I absolutely would bet on the UK. Right? So it's not that we lack the attributes, we have them. We just lack the management. There's 3 levels of failures. One is we've lost the ability to grow. 2 is we've lost the ability to manage our affairs well, domestically, economically. And 3rd, we've lost the ability to interact with the rest of the world in a beneficial manner. And all 3 can be fixed. Okay. And I actually think what's coming in terms of the green transition, the generative AI, is a massive opportunity to accelerate that change.
Okay, well that's great. That's the positive note. Thank you, Mohamed El-Erian. Thank you so much for this conversation, this fireside chat. Thank you all of you for being here as well. I know that Mohamed has to get a train back up to Cambridge very soon. So thank you very much for listening to us.